I've said pretty consistently that I think the Federal Reserve deserves some credit for taming inflation while not devolving us into a recession. But what do I know? I haven't studied economics formally for about 50 years, I think. But Gary Gales, he knows. He's a professor at Pepperdine University and the author of Freedom in One Lesson. And we've got a lot to talk to Professor Gales about. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, John.
It's my pleasure.
I
So,
like the truth.
well, thank you. I do too, actually. And President Trump has been highly critical of Jerome Powell, calling him too late Jerome. What's your opinion? What do you think?
Well, I think that what Trump has said, and he was even playing with advance notification of his replacement. I think Powell's term is up in 11 months. And so, as a way to put pressure on Powell, he was going to announce in advance who his next Fed chairman was to put pressure on Powell to do what he wanted. Right? That's kind of an interesting angle to get what you want. But one has to remember that every president wants lower interest rates when they're in office. Whatever they want to do, the lower the cost of borrowing for the government, the cheaper it is for them. That does not mean that more government is a good idea.
Well, on that we agree. But isn't lower interest or aren't lower interest rates good for the consumer as well, and
Well, yeah,
investors?
lower interest rates are good for every borrower. By the way, they're bad for every retiree because it lowers the return on their savings. So
Through
it's not
the
an unambiguous thing. But if you're measuring productivity, yeah, things get cheaper. But what happens if they get so much cheaper that you're paying 80% of the real cost? You might make a lot of mistakes. It's going to show up in the data as stimulus. But what if the things you buy because interest rates are so low aren't really worth the money? Then you get stuck with bad investments later. And there's a lot of lag things. I know in the
Mhm.
early 80s, you're such a young guy. I'm
I
sure you don't
wish.
know this.
I'm probably older
But
than you are,
in the
actually.
80s, there was this boom in 82, 83 in the deficit under Reagan. That boom was almost entirely caused by the lagged effect of Jimmy Carter's deficits because the average duration of government debt is about 7 years. So if you say, in effect, it only in the first year after interest rates rise or they fall, only about 1/7 of the debt is at that new low interest rate because
Sure.
it's been reset.
Right.
But so that means it takes 4, 5, 6, 7 years before the full effects of the deficit show up. So Reagan got all this grief in 82, 83 for look at your deficit. And if you look at why, it was all interest on the debt. Because remember, prime rate was up to 21.5%.
Under Jimmy
And
Carter.
right,
Yeah.
that doesn't show up. So you have basically an entire presidential term lag in looking at those things,
Interesting. That
right? So
is a
yes,
great
I mean, he is trying to get
analysis.
lower interest rates, and other things equal, lower interest rates are good. But that's only if those interest rates actually reflect what people's time preferences are.
So we go
Yeah.
back to Jimmy Carter. We had 21% interest rates, but that was designed to whip inflation now, which is something that Gerald Ford was unable to do. And now we've had 9% inflation under Biden. And it's just not 9%. It's the cumulative effect year after year after year. So it went from 9 to 5 to 4 and now somewhere around 3. So you add that up, it amounts to a lot of
That's a
price
lot.
increases,
As an
right?
illustration, by the way, I happen to be doing some research about rental things, and I came across thing between 2019 and 2022. Rental rates on housing went up 30%. And when you're talking about the cumulative effect of each of
Right.
those years, that's very large, which makes one of the things people are arguing about, could these trade embargoes lead to inflation? And they're making this distinction between could it make prices go up now? Sure. You reduce output for the same amount of demand, price is going to rise. But they're talking about ongoing inflation, right? It can make prices rise, but it can't make them keep rising. Well, the prices are higher forever. It's not like the effects are just felt this year. So people are trying to misrepresent things and muddy the waters right now about this sort of stuff.
So, what do you think about Powell and the Federal Reserve? Have they done a good job of this
Well,
high wire act of balancing interest rates to tame inflation against keeping us from
that's
devolving
what
into a
their job is
recession?
supposed to be.
Yes.
But I would start by saying, really, a great deal of the cause of this problem was the Fed. The Fed had the most profligate policy in its history, which led to all this inflation. So they were the biggest cause. Fiscal policy was expansionary too. Restrictive, regulatory policy is partly to blame too. But they were the main cause. They caused this. So when someone says I can fix the problem I caused, I'm always a little suspicious, right? So are they doing what it says in the law they're trying to do? Yeah, they're trying to balance it and do this stuff. So if you looked at them right now, I think they're a net plus in that Trump's arguments for why interest rates should go down now are bullshit. He doesn't really have an argument. His argument is, I want it to be cheaper so my budgets look like they're better, right? That's like, if you want to look at what it says, fix the spending that you hired Doge to get everything to do that. The stuff in the great big beautiful bill, whatever it's called, right? That doesn't cut spending hardly at all. The problem we're hurtling towards, right, is dumb spending. We have to get rid of more of that, and we haven't done that very well.
I totally agree. It's reckless, and it's just basically a move to buy votes. I mean, that's what it is. It's pork. It's pork to get people to vote.
That's the attraction of liberty and libertarian ideas, is that libertarians will generally tell you the truth, unlike the other parties. The reason is libertarians don't believe in stealing from you through government. Well, that means I can't threaten you with harm if you don't support me, and I can't buy your support if you do, because I can't steal from anybody else. Both the Republicans and Democrats are more than willing to steal from other people, just so long as they're from the other coalition, right? So the idea is that most of the libertarians I've known them for a long time, they tell you what they think, which is a huge advantage if you want to understand. In today's environment, look at the name of your show, The Truth, right? How do you find out what the truth is when both the Republicans and Democrats routinely lie? The data is imperfect, although imperfectly recognized. In my macro classes, I have to teach my students that there is not a single measurement in macro that's correct, not one. Because what you want to measure is often unmeasurable, and all of them have limitations of lags and these other things. So people are out there, they pick one piece of data that supports their story, and then they say, therefore. Right? You can't do that.
Well, in today's climate, we can look at trends, and we do see a trending of lower interest rates. The unemployment seems very sticky. That's the thing that concerns me the most. We got 4.3% unemployment, yet every small business owner and every hiring professional that I ever talked to says we just can't find good people. Well, if you multiply 4.3 times 300 million, we ought to be able to come up with enough good people to fill those jobs, but it just doesn't seem to happen.
Well, I think part of that is the state level and local level problems. For instance, LA just voted to raise the minimum wage of hotel workers to $30 an hour.
My gosh.
Well,
there goes my vacation to LA.
And you know why? It's because the Olympics are coming.
Yes.
Hotel and motel taxes, and this is just a way to get that, is something that is largely imposed by outsiders.
So they found a new group to steal from. The people visiting from foreign countries are going to be staying in LA for the Olympics.
Well, the hotel and motel taxes or bed taxes, they're already very high. But this is just yet another way to tax those out-of-towners, right? By saying, if I force you to pay more for your help, you're going to have to raise the rate. So those things are going to benefit. So, I mean, some of that is local regulations that have restricted our ability to produce. I mean, we have not really deregulated very much for all Trump has argued to try to get that to happen. If you look at the housing market, basically everywhere you look, there are so many restrictions on building housing. Well, you can let more people in, but if no one's going to buy those houses, right? Or, it costs so much to produce them, you're not going to get more of what people are wanting.
So it seems to me, as I've looked from 30,000 feet, a 30,000 foot view, that Donald Trump is intentionally and overtly trying to remake the United States economy. He is wanting to.
Absolutely true.
He's lowering taxes. He is reducing regulations. He is trying to pass the big, beautiful bill that you referred to. He's encouraging the Fed to reduce interest rates. And I majored in economics in college. I hope I would have gotten at least a B in your class. I don't know, but I did pretty good in it.
I'm a
Actually,
pretty hard reader.
I loved it, but I've probably forgotten more than I can remember now. But it does seem that these are the right moves to usher in a true golden age. What do you think?
Well, those particular things are a good idea. The bit about interest rates, again, the issue is what ultimately should drive interest rates in the economy is your and my preferences. How much are you willing to give up to consume sooner? How much am I willing to demand? So as long as it matches our preferences, right? Lower interest rates mean we want to save more now for future consumption and consume less. If it reflects our preferences. When the Fed, though, steps in and pumps more reserves in the system and artificially lowers the interest rate below what we would do, it's introducing mistakes, right?
So am I reading between the lines? Would that infer that people are going to go further in debt and that their credit card balances are going to balloon? That wouldn't be a good policy,
to the extent
would it?
it's driven by the cost of that, to the extent it's driven by the economy scenario and how much income you have, you got some other things going on there too. But so the real question, and people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek have argued that the interest rate is the most important price in the economy, because every one of us every day is making choices between current consumption and savings or investment that leads to more future consumption. Well, if that price is wrong, we're going to make mistakes, right? From our perspective, it's right given that interest rate, but to the extent that interest rate is an artificial thing that does not reflect our real circumstances, you get in real trouble.
But the Gale's philosophy would argue that energy is really the greater cost to the.
Well, I think energy is the most important single determinant of incentives to produce in the short run. And that's the good part about this, the potential good part about the attacks on Iran. If you could make it so that all the places in the Middle, everybody in the Middle East is safer than they were before, right? That means you can make more peaceful arrangements. You're going to have more reliable oil. Those prices are going to be down if that works.
But
right? If they block Hormuz or do whatever their strategy is to punish us, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be the case. Although that's why I think the market in oil reflected so much when they first did the bomb. Oil prices went up almost $10 a barrel first day. The next day, they went down almost $10 a barrel because of Iran's response. Iran sent missiles back that were intentionally designed not to hurt anybody. It was just, play for the domestic audience that I'm doing something, right? Those missiles they sent, they didn't send many, and they weren't very well aimed, and all but one was shot down, and it wasn't shot down because it was off target. Well, what does that tell people? They're not going to do something to disrupt the oil market. Yep. They could have bombed oil refineries. They could have bombed, holding facilities, and they chose not to. So it's like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Oh, it's all right.
That raises another question that I ponder frequently. Don't we have a lot of oil in this country that we could exploit? And instead of making other countries filthy rich, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Iran, that we could just use our own oil and it would make the American people really rich because it would lower the cost of goods and because of the cost of energy would be cheaper, and we would stop being dependent on these foreign countries. So why don't we have the resolve to do that? We are the
biggest producer of oil in the world, have been for the last 4 years. All that slant drilling and all that stuff has made us the producer. But the question is, how effectively can you export it? Under the Biden administration, they tried to hold up all the compressed natural gas export facilities so you couldn't do it. So Europe could have been buying our compressed natural gas instead of getting a pipeline from Russia that was then bombed, right? But because it takes a long time to build those facilities and the tankers and the system, right, it's just slow to respond. In fact, there's a glut of oil most people consider right now. We're producing so much that some American producers are simply leaving it in the ground when they could be doing it because the prices are too low compared to what they think is going to happen in the future. So we are already producing a lot, but those international connections, what about our shipping to, say, Hawaii. Let's pick Hawaii or Puerto Rico. If there's something called the Jones Act that requires shipments from American port to an American port to be on ships built by Americans, crewed by Americans, owned by Americans, called the Jones Act.
I'm
But
familiar.
tankers built in America are something like 6 times more expensive than tankers built in Korea as a result. Well, that means that since Hawaii has to import all their energy, if they buy it from America, like Alaska, which is the most obvious connection, Alaskan crude, they have to pay extraordinarily high prices to do so. They're importing oil from Asia to there to avoid the Jones Act. Well, I mean, that's something that Trump could do. If he doesn't like regulations, the Jones Act doesn't work. It has basically destroyed our ship making in America. It has made us less safe. Cato has a whole website connected to what's wrong with the Jones Act. That would be a great thing that would lower the price of oil in Alaska because they're not connected, so you have to ship it, right? In Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and it would allow exporting from other American places that are a lot closer to those things than where they're getting it from now.
So
Um,
the Professor Gales would give the Jones Act a big fat F, if I understand you correctly.
and if you're curious what the arguments are, you could go to the Cato Institute site. I think Colin Grabow's in charge of it, or you could just search my name and type in Jones Act, and you can find a couple articles about it.
Wonderful. I will go there and do just that. So, what do you think about the big, beautiful bill? It's being debated in the Senate right now. It's about to go back to the House. The House has drawn a red line that they're not going to renegotiate the SALT component of the big, beautiful bill, which is a major bone of contention in the Senate. How does it all get resolved and what's going to happen? Will they be able to do it by Independence Day?
Well, I'm not sure how it gets resolved, although the Speaker of the House has great power to punish people, unlike the guy in charge of the Senate, where it's hurting cats. The issue here, in terms of the Republican coalition, has to do a lot with SALT, right? The SALT, that $10,000 which they're arguing over and so forth,
Mhm.
and it's because there are Republican congressmen in high tax, largely Democratic states that's a huge cost of their constituents, and they're saying, you know what, whatever the value to everybody else, unless you cut me a better deal, I'm not going to vote for it. And that's the largest group that wants to vote in. I've also written about SALT, and my argument is completely different than what they're talking about. They want to say, well, you got to make this deductible. Well, my argument at heart would be a different one. Aren't we supposed to get valuable things from our government for our taxes? If
Well,
government does what is a good idea, and they tax us 10 grand and they gave us 11 grand in benefits, wouldn't we be better off, not worse off?
I don't know.
If
A
we're
lot of people believe that or espouse the belief that aren't we glad we don't get our money's worth from government because it would
well,
probably be more oppression and fascism.
yes, that's true in the sense that what they're trying to do, we get more than enough of. What they ought to be doing, we're not getting enough of.
Right.
But I mean, if this is the case, it wasn't until I think World War II where it was deductible. State and local taxes were deductible against federal taxes. Well, if we're getting our money's worth, they're making better schools that we value enough to pay for. When we pay those taxes, we've already gotten more than that in benefits. If that was the case, we wouldn't object to higher taxes.
So let me ask you, and this is a theory that I've been exploring and trying to get my head around. But if when our economy gets in trouble, what's the first thing the government does?
Screw it up more.
Well, they start spending money more irrationally, don't they? They call it stimulus, right?
Yeah, they do call it a stimulus.
All right, so what happens if we truly decide that we want to balance the federal budget? Doesn't that inherently, well, there are only two ways to do it, either raise revenue or lower spending. Most people, like me, would prefer to see it through lower spending. Isn't that going to be a destimulus and it has the potential to constrain our economy? What do you
Well,
think? How do you have
in the
we get our
data,
cake and eat it too?
it will appear to be harmful, right? We're going to be spending less money.
Yeah.
But you have to realize at heart, I can spend my money for myself, whatever I want. I like me. I know me, I will make better choices than if the government takes that dollar from me, spends it allegedly on my behalf. I'm worse off. So the real problem is when money is spent by government, it isn't spent as well as if we spend it for ourselves,
So what
right?
I
So
hear
all
you
the data
saying,
looks, we're spending less to buy government goods. But what if we got 20 cents on the dollar for what the government spends? So the data will look bad, even though the reality might be pretty good. And World War II is actually, the end of World War II is an example. At the end of World War II was the largest drop in GDP in American history
hmm
because wartime production fell. Well, they were counting bombers produced as adding to GDP, even though they ended up lined up on on airfields all over the earth and decommissioned. Right? This idea is that you got to look at the data and what it's measuring. It's counting every dollar government spends as if it's worth a dollar.
so if I understand what you're saying correctly, if the government lowered its spending and gave that money back to the taxpayers, they would in turn use that dollar and spend it and actually contribute to the GDP
Yeah,
in a
and, well,
real
and
way.
spend it better than the dollar would have been spent.
Yes, I like
Right? So
that
it's
idea. Well,
well, I
that's
mean,
now the
because so
Gales
the
Gordon
data doesn't do
formula.
that. I mean, the example I use in my class is what's an aircraft carrier worth? Aircraft carrier costs about $4 billion to build, a couple $1 billion a year to run. So, what is it worth? Well, you don't have any place as a taxpayer to reflect exactly what that's worth because don't get to vote on it. So what happens is we have no idea what that's really worth to us. It could be worth more than it costs. What if it could deter aggression or stop a future war? Then it would be worth more than it, a lot more. But what if we build more weapons so everybody else says, oh my God, those imperialistic Americans are going to attack us? Let's build more weapons too. More weapons can make us less safe. Well, so what happens is we have no idea what the military spending's worth, right? We just don't know. So they make the assumption that it's worth whatever they spent. Well, you know, they failed to do an audit on the Defense Department in any of the last 7 years because there's not enough data. They've lost so much stuff. Kind of hard to think that in general we get our money's worth from a lot of that spending.
Lost or destroyed. So now 77 million people voted for Donald Trump. It seems like there has been a very dramatic shift to more conservative policies. And then this week, the state of or the city of New York favors Zohran Mamdani, who is a leftist socialist. What is going on? Why do each coast seem to just drag us down?
Well, partly environmentalists and left wingers seem to know where good climates are in some case on the West Coast, and they're where that action is on the East Coast in the big cities, right? If you wanted to redistribute income towards yourself, how much redistribution happens in rural counties? They don't have enough resources.
Mm-hmm.
How much redistribution is possible in Manhattan? You have all these resources to try and steal and give to others. And that's what his campaign was. More rent controls. We don't have enough of it, right? Government stores that are going to do it better than anybody else. Yeah, when that's going to happen, I don't know.
So I don't want to get us too far off track, but have worked in the inner city in Atlanta for 20 years trying to help revitalize the poorest zip code in America. The worst social ills that exist on earth can be found in one zip code in 60 blocks in Atlanta. Worst demographic for HIV, unemployment, literacy, obesity. You name the social ill, and it's found in that 60 square block area of English Avenue. And so I have worked to try and revitalize it, and a lot of other people came to the party, and we have made a lot of progress. My belief is that philanthropy can do it so much more effectively than government. What do you think? And how do we do it? How do we get there?
Oh, I think it's absolutely true. America historically is the most philanthropic place on earth, right? Where voluntary things, or you think back to Ben Franklin, right? He organized volunteer fire departments. He funded libraries. He gave money to other religions to build churches in Philadelphia, right? He knew how important that community and having good incentives and finding ways to use things better, he knew how important that was. How much of that gets attention today would be my thought. I don't hear anybody talking about what's really good for society. It's always this group, that group, whatever. Well, the
Exactly.
problem,
That is the exact point that I was trying and wanting to get to. The 98% of English Avenue is African American. And I know a great percentage of the people that live there by their first names. And I have found them to be genuinely loving, kind, wonderful people with a great spirit. But the leadership in English Avenue repelled us as strongly as anything I've ever seen when we first got there. And I'm not talking about the unelected leadership. They embraced us. The elected leadership wanted us to put them on the payroll as consultants. And when we refused to do so, they became our greatest detractors.
well, in Los Angeles, near where I live,
Yeah. So I'm getting to the point. One of my friends, he was a city councilman. He called these people the poverty pimps, and they used racism as a way to get their way. And so I've got this notion that racism in America today is not because of inherent disdain between blacks and whites, whites and Hispanics. I think that some of our political leaders continue to stoke the flames of racism because it serves to them and keeps them in elective office. Now, is that just a crazy thought? What, do you have any observations?
it's a thought I would say amen to. I look at some of the politicians in LA, and that's exactly the same. My view is then poverty pimps is a good prescription.
Yeah.
What happens is, what happens if you solve the problem of poverty? What happens to their support? You can't allow the problem that you're campaigning on to be solved because there's no point in hiring you. So this idea is that their absolutely incentive is to keep them from recovering because that keeps them in power.
What
I
a
mean, I think
sad
of some people say,
commentary.
who would vote for them if it wasn't for the promise I'm going to steal for you because you're so needy?
Yeah. Yeah. And then effectively enslave them for life then because they make them wards of the state rather than being able to experience the joy of work and the sense of accomplishment that comes from it. All
And
right.
I think education is a big part of that because the government, everything they do about education is almost everything is wrong. It's for let's help the teachers unions and screw the students if it comes down to that.
I got
Right.
so much more I want
That's
to
part
talk
of
to
that
you about.
lifelong penalty.
Now you're out there at Pepperdine. Now, what's the climate at Pepperdine? I mean, we've heard a lot about educational institutions like Harvard and Yale being just incredibly woke and left wingist. Where does Pepperdine fit on the political
Well,
spectrum, and how do you get along with your colleagues?
Pepperdine's reputation is as a conservative university. Now, I'm a great deal of that reputation because I've written several thousand articles, and I'm advocating freedom and liberty in every one of those articles. So I think my writing has influenced that stuff, and they would drag me out every once in a while if they have a libertarian donor. But what was interesting about that is there was a guy who was at Loyola Marymount in LA. He's now at George Mason. Anyway, he did a study comparing the registrations of the professorate at 8 West Coast universities, right? He wanted to see what it was. Of those 8, Pepperdine was the most conservative. Now,
That's good to know.
it was also the same as the national preferences. So if you're the same as the population in your preferences, you are considered a right-wing university. Really what happens is universities are so left-wing, incredibly left-wing, right? If you don't get the pain of going to a faculty lunchroom and listening to the bullshit, you don't know. But I mean, so they were, when they did the study, they were basically the average for the population. But that makes it a right-wing university. So instead of saying, wait, what this shows is the people who are the elite ignore your preferences. Their preferences are entirely left of yours, right? So if somebody speaks up on the other side at all, they then attack them. So Yes, I've gotten criticism.
Well, look, a friend of mine, when I was, I won't get into it, but anyway, I got some nice recognition for the work that I did in English Avenue, and that really brought the politicians that were against us out and started attacking us. That
Well, remember,
I got
you're
picketed.
getting attention. That means you're an outlet for them to do their usual bull.
Sure, but one of our supporters said, "John, don't you know dogs don't chase parked cars?" And so I found a lot of solace in that. It's become my mantra. So don't worry about the fact that you've attracted a lot of criticism. You've touched on a couple of things I've got a curiosity about. And like I've inferred from what you've said, not inferred, I mean, I think you've been very open about your libertarian views. And I consider myself to be a Ronald Reagan Republican, but with libertarian views towards a lot of social issues. Some of my very devout and fond friends have said, well, John, that's really kind of a cop-out because, you can say, well, I'm just going to be a libertarian, live and let live, but that's not really consistent with the teachings of the Bible. What do you think? How do you reconcile those two conflicting views?
Well, I seem to remember that in the Bible, Jesus, or I think maybe it was Peter, he's talking about you should pray for your leaders and so forth. But what's the role of government that is cited there? It's almost not mentioned at all. The point of government is to, make sure that people who do good are rewarded for it and that people who do evil are punished. Well, that last part, that is the only real thing government could potentially do for us better than we could.
But they never do. And I love John Kennedy. I love Rand Paul. I like the speaker. But and Jim Jordan, and I point blank challenged Jim Jordan over at a dinner with about 12 people. And I said, look, I love you. You're great. And you get up there and you rail on people and you're pounding the desk and you're just saying everything I feel. And then nothing happens. Where is the accountability? We've got Epstein in the files. We know that our own government assassinated the 35th president of the United States. There are so many, and Building 7, for God's sakes. There are so many questions. I don't know how to reconcile all of that, frankly. But where is the accountability? We've now caught the CIA red-handed being complicit in Kennedy's assassination, and it's crickets. When are we going to start holding these people accountable?
Well, I think we have a short attention span. And if somebody put a little bauble, look what I'm giving you now in front of us, we would say, well, who cares about that 35 years ago or whatever, however long ago it was. The people are bribed. The founding fathers were very clear. The only way you can have a government that doesn't do evil, does good, is that the people are good. If you and I would refuse to vote for these stupid people, they wouldn't be there.
Okay, so I've got
what happens is we're not a moral people. I'm more than happy to steal from you, and you're willing to steal from me as a general rule.
Well, that's greed is a natural human condition. I agree. But look, this is my premise. If we're going to allow the assassination of a United States president with no repercussions to virtually anyone, except for the witnesses who dared to come forward and say what they saw, I call it, Reagan called it trickle-down economics. I call it trickle-down ethics, because we have now conveyed to every bad bureaucrat in the entire country, local, state, and national, that if you've got the power, you can break the law and you can get away with it scot-free. And so what is the effect of that? We become a fascist state in the long run. To me, that's why we need to go back, open a Kennedy investigation, hold the people that did it accountable, even in memoriam. I know that the Dulles Airport was named for John Foster Dulles, but I'm sorry, guilty by association, change the name of the frickin' airport, remove Lyndon Baines Johnson from every schoolhouse in America, and change the name of the FBI building in Washington and take Hoover's name off of it. Now, I think that those would be very good, pragmatic steps, and then go through Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, all the atrocities that have occurred in America, shine light on it, It's the best disinfectant that exists, and get real morality and virtue back into our country's ecosystem. Otherwise, I think we're doomed to fail. I really do.
I don't disagree. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that oftentimes people will try to dismiss what economists say, right?
Not
Well,
me.
this is some highfalutin whatever stuff, right? Because they're economists, because people don't understand it, so it's easy to abuse. But Leonard Read started from the position of a moral philosopher. He didn't start by asking economics questions. He said, let's ask what's right and wrong. And if you would give me if you have a minute, his biographer made an interesting statement about him. He said, Read was a moral philosopher, not an economist, though his principles made him a pretty good free market economist. In his conclusion, no one, neither private individual nor public agency, should take property by force or coercion from one person for the benefit of another. So he didn't start from economics. He started from moral philosophy, which is more amenable to more common understanding. Right? And I like that. Adam Smith, remember, was a professor of moral philosophy. He wasn't an economist. Economics didn't exist. The best place to start for these kind of questions is with moral philosophy. Again, if the government is stealing from you to give to me or vice versa, that should be stopped. It shouldn't have ever been started, but we're so overwhelmed with things the government shouldn't do. How do you get a foothold, a lever to make it better?
I think it starts by showing up. I mean, how many people do you know that actually will go to a city council meeting or a school board meeting? I think that the American people need to wake up and get off the couch and go become activists at every level of government. And then I think we have a chance.
Well, I think even before activism, they're not informed. The thing that amazes me is how massively uninformed people are. But then if in today's environment, your vote won't change anything, you think, which is generally true, right? They basically say, I'm not going to figure out this stuff because my vote won't matter. Well, in the long run, figuring out this stuff is how you inform other people, how your kids know. It's the possibility that the remnant, as it's sometimes been called, right? The people who still hold on to those things can pass that on and maybe make a comeback some point.
So you wrote the book, Freedom in One Lesson, and it's about Leonard Read, is it not?
Well, it's Leonard Read's best work. He wrote almost 30 books, innumerable articles. He gave speeches and stuff, and I went through that whole thing. And the reason this is important is he stopped publishing. He died, right? His massive output in the early 80s. Well, that was just where everything else was going online, where it was permanently accessible. His stuff was all in print, right? And not particularly well organized, for posterity. Well, that means a whole generation has not heard what he has to say, and what he said was important. He was perhaps the central character in resurrecting libertarian ideas. The institution he founded, the Foundation for Economic Education, which he started in 1946, and everybody told him it wouldn't work, was designed to defend the principles of freedom against the growing, administrative apparatus, the socialistic tendencies, and so forth. He was the central character, and we don't know what he said. And he had a particular skill that most people don't in economics. He was able to say things in commonly understood language. That's really his brilliance. He would disguise real important truths because we understood it. Well, I, in many ways, have patterned my career after that. I basically did enough official academic work to proceed, but I thought getting real people to understand real things was far more important. So almost all I wrote about in my 40-some-year career, 2,000 articles plus, was about, can I commit where you will think carefully? If you will do that, I was doing what Leonard Read was doing, or trying to. So you should read all my other stuff, but read the Leonard Read part first.
Well, I'd be delighted to, and I will. Now, where do I find the Freedom in One Lesson?
It was published by the Ludwig von Mises Institute, not far from that place in Atlanta.
Sure. Over there in Alabama.
Auburn is where they're located. It's just where it was published, so they have it. Or you could just go to Amazon. It's available in hardback, paperback, Audible, all sorts of ways.
Well, you have my commitment. You've made one more sale today. I'm going to rush to get it. I can't wait to read it. I've been doing this show for about 3 years. We're on in 22 AM and FM radio stations up and down the East Coast, from Nashville, Atlanta, Richmond, Norfolk, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Morgantown, West Virginia, on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We also come to you on YouTube, Getter, Rumble, Facebook, and a couple other places. Anthony, you'll have to prime me. But you can watch the live stream right now on getter.com. We welcome you to join us there. What a fascinating time we've gotten to spend with Professor Gary Gales, author of Freedom in One Lesson. You can get his book on Amazon, or you can go to the Mises Institute, which is just across the Alabama border from us. And we look forward to welcoming you back to the truth, Professor Gales. It has been a pleasure.
Okay, well, I'd love to be back. So anything that pushes the truth is a good thing.
Well, I appreciate that, and we do our best every Saturday from noon to 2 right here on the John Fredericks Media Network, as well as CDM Press, which also takes our feed and puts it out on their 13 digital platforms. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.